On the morning of February 17th, 1600, as Rome stirred awake beneath a pale winter sky, a man was led through its streets in silence. His mouth was clamped shut with iron, not to stop him from crying out in pain, but to prevent him from speaking. Because even after 7 years of imprisonment, interrogation, isolation, and slow psychological ruin, Giordano Bruno's words were still considered dangerous. Dangerous enough to gag. As the cart creaked forward toward Campo da Fiori, smoke from nearby hearths drifted low through the air, blurring the edges of the city. The crowd that gathered was not loud. Executions had become common enough that shock was no longer required. Some came out of devotion, some out of curiosity, some because the church had made it clear that attendance itself was a lesson. At the center of the cart stood Bruno, thin, half-naked, shackled at the wrists and ankles, his body marked by years of confinement. His beard was long and unkempt. His eyes, according to later accounts, were not wild with fear. They were steady, watchful, almost calm. The church would later insist this was the face of a stubborn heretic, a man too proud to admit his errors. But pride was not what had brought him here. Giordano Bruno was being executed because he refused to accept a universe that ended where authority said it should. By the time the flames reached him, Bruno had been worn down in every way except one. His body was weak, his freedom gone, his reputation destroyed, his books banned, his name condemned. But the one thing the Inquisition could not break, despite 7 years of relentless pressure, was his refusal to lie. To understand why the church feared him so deeply, you must understand the world he came from and the world he imagined. Giordano Bruno was born Filippo Bruno in 1548 in the small town of Nola, near Naples. Southern Italy at the time was a land of tension, caught between Renaissance curiosity and medieval obedience. Knowledge was expanding, but permission to think was still tightly controlled. Universities taught Aristotle as unquestionable truth. Theology was law. The cosmos itself had a fixed shape, a fixed center, and a fixed hierarchy. God above, angels below, earth at the center. Everything else arranged like a celestial machine. Bruno never accepted this order. From an early age, he showed signs of mind that did not rest easily within boundaries. He memorized vast amounts of text with disturbing ease. He questioned teachers openly. He argued where others bowed. At 17, he entered the Dominican order, taking the name Giordano. On the surface, it looked like submission. In reality, it was infiltration. The monastery gave him access to books, dangerous books, forbidden books, works by thinkers the church tolerated only in fragments, stripped of their most radical ideas. Bruno read them whole, and then he went further. He read ancient Greek philosophy, Hermetic texts, Neoplatonism, early Automists, mystical writings that suggested the universe was alive, infinite, and divine in ways the church could not control. He absorbed these ideas and fused them into something explosive. Even as a young friar, Bruno was already marked as a problem. He removed images of saints from his cell, keeping only a crucifix. He questioned the Trinity. He spoke openly against blind reverence. He mocked those who repeated doctrine without understanding it. The Dominicans noticed. By his early 20s, Bruno was under investigation for heresy. The charges were not yet formal, but the danger was clear. And Bruno did what he would do many times in his life. He ran. What followed was nearly 2 decades of wandering exile across Europe. Bruno became a man without a home, without protection, without allegiance. He moved from city to city, court to court, university to university, carrying his ideas like contraband. In Geneva, he clashed with Calvinists and was briefly imprisoned. In Paris, he found favor at the royal court. His memory techniques amazed scholars and nobles alike. He could recite entire books after a single reading. Kings listened. Professors bristled. In England, he lectured and debated publicly, openly ridiculing the intellectual establishment. He called university scholars pedants and asses, accused them of worshiping dead men's ideas instead of seeking truth themselves. He did not merely disagree. He humiliated. But it was his cosmology that truly sealed his fate. Bruno embraced the Copernican model, which placed the sun, not Earth, at the center of the known planetary system. But he refused to stop there. To Bruno, Copernicus had only cracked the door. He kicked it open. He argued that the universe had no center at all, that space extended infinitely in all directions, that the stars were not fixed lights embedded in a crystal sphere, but distant suns, each potentially surrounded by their own worlds that might harbor life. In the late 16th century, this was not just wrong. It was blasphemous. An infinite universe implied an infinite creation. An infinite creation implied a God not confined to doctrine. And a God not confined to doctrine meant the church was not the sole interpreter of divine truth. That idea alone was lethal. But Bruno went even further. He suggested that God was not separate from the universe, but present within it, that divinity flowed through all matter, that nature itself was sacred. To church authorities, this sounded dangerously close to pantheism, the idea that God and the universe were one. If God was everywhere, then he was not controlled by Rome. Bruno published his ideas openly. He debated them publicly. He mocked those who feared them. He seemed to believe that truth, once spoken, could protect itself. He was wrong. Everywhere Bruno went, enemies accumulated. Scholars he embarrassed. Clergy he outraged. Institutions he exposed. Protection was always temporary. Patronage always conditional. By the early 1590s, Bruno was tired, older, poorer. His bravado remained, but the world had grown smaller. It was then that a Venetian nobleman named Giovanni Mocenigo offered him something irresistible: shelter, security, and a promise of safety from Rome. Venice, after all, was independent, proud, resistant to papal control. Bruno accepted. It was the greatest mistake of his life. Mocenigo was not a philosopher. He was insecure, paranoid, and deeply superstitious. He had invited Bruno not out of admiration, but out of hunger. He wanted Bruno's memory techniques, his secrets, his power. And when Bruno refused to give him everything, resentment curdled into fear. Mocenigo began to believe Bruno was dangerous, perhaps demonic, perhaps cursed. On May 22nd, 1592, Mocenigo locked Bruno inside his home and summoned the Venetian Inquisition. He accused Bruno of heresy, blasphemy, denial of core Christian doctrines, and even sorcery. Bruno was arrested that same day. At first, he believed reason might still save him. Venice was not Rome. The interrogations were tense but restrained. Bruno defended himself carefully, sometimes conceding ambiguity, sometimes arguing semantics. He tried to appear cooperative without surrendering his beliefs. But Rome was watching. The Vatican demanded extradition. Venice resisted for a time, but political pressure mounted. And in 1593, Giordano Bruno was transferred to Rome, delivered directly into the hands of the Roman Inquisition. This was not an arrest. It was a burial. From the moment Bruno entered Roman custody, the process changed. There would be no debate, no public defense, no intellectual sparring. The Roman Inquisition did not argue ideas. It erased them. Bruno was placed in a series of prisons, cold, damp, and deliberately disorienting. Cells with minimal light, minimal contact, minimal sound. Silence was enforced as discipline. His books were confiscated. His writings examined line by line. Statements he had made decades earlier were resurrected and twisted into formal charges. The accusations multiplied. Denial of the Trinity, denial of Christ's divinity, belief in multiple worlds, belief in the eternity of the universe, belief that souls could migrate, belief that Moses used magic, belief that Jesus was not uniquely divine. Some of these claims were distortions. Others were philosophical positions taken out of context, but truth was irrelevant now. The Inquisition was not seeking clarification. It was seeking submission. Interrogations came in waves. Long periods of isolation followed by sudden questioning. The same questions repeated again and again, phrased slightly differently, designed to trap, confuse, and exhaust. Bruno was pressured to recant, not everything, just enough. A partial surrender, a technical admission, a signature on a document crafted to sound harmless, but loaded with theological landmines. He refused. Years passed like this. Not days, not months, years. 7 of them. And as time dragged on, the patience of the church wore thin. Bruno's endurance became an insult, because every day he lived without kneeling was proof that the Inquisition could cage a body, but not a mind. By the end of his first years in Roman custody, Giordano Bruno understood something with terrifying clarity. This was never about correcting error. It was about making an example. And if he would not break, they would burn him instead. Time inside a Roman Inquisition prison did not pass the way it did outside. Days were not marked by sunlight. Weeks were not divided by routine. Months bled into one another in a darkness designed to erase sequence, memory, and hope. Giordano Bruno would later struggle to recall exactly how long he had been confined before certain interrogations took place, and that confusion was intentional. The cell he was first placed in was small enough that he could touch both walls if he stretched his arms. Moisture crept constantly down the stone, leaving the floor slick and cold. The air smelled of mold, rust, and human waste. There was no bed, only straw, replaced irregularly. Light came through a narrow slit high in the wall, insufficient to track the sun. Silence was enforced, but not peace. Some nights were broken by distant screams, short, muffled, abruptly cut off. Other nights, the prison was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that presses inward, forcing a man to listen to his own thoughts until they turn against him. This was not negligence. It was strategy. The Roman Inquisition understood something deeply. Physical pain could be endured. Isolation, uncertainty, and the slow dismantling of identity were far more effective. Bruno was interrogated intermittently, never on a predictable schedule. Sometimes days would pass without a word spoken to him. Sometimes he would be dragged from his cell with no warning, questioned for hours, then returned without explanation. At first, the tone was almost civil. The inquisitors asked him to clarify his writings, to explain what he meant, to distinguish metaphor from belief. They spoke calmly, even gently, as if misunderstanding, not malice, had brought him here. Bruno responded carefully. He had learned long ago that words could be weapons turned against their speaker. He qualified his statements. He appealed to philosophy rather than theology. He emphasized speculation, not dogma. But the questions kept coming back. Do you believe the universe is infinite? Do you believe there are countless worlds? Do you believe Christ is divine? Do you believe the soul survives death? Do you believe God exists apart from creation, or within it? Each answer was recorded. Each hesitation noted. Each contradiction real or manufactured, filed away. As months turned into years, the interrogations hardened. The inquisitors stopped pretending they were confused. Now they accused. They read back his own words, stripped of context, twisted into absolutes. They demanded simple answers to complex ideas. Yes or no. Bruno tried to resist this framing. Philosophy did not bend easily to binaries. But the Inquisition was not philosophical. It was legalistic. Truth, to them, was a matter of obedience. The pressure intensified. Food was reduced at times. The cell grew colder. Access to washing was limited. Bruno's beard grew long and matted. His clothes rotted on his body. Lice and sickness were common companions. And still, he refused to recant. At various points, intermediaries were sent to him, fellow Dominicans, learned clerics, men who spoke softly of mercy, of forgiveness, of the church's willingness to welcome him back if only he would submit. They framed recantation as humility, as obedience, as salvation. They told him he could live. Bruno listened, and then he declined. Not angrily, not dramatically. He simply said he could not affirm what he did not believe. This refusal puzzled and enraged his captors. Most men broke long before this stage. Some screamed, some begged, some signed whatever was placed in front of them just to make the suffering stop. Bruno did not. Historians still debate the extent of physical torture used against him. Official records are frustratingly vague, deliberately so. The Roman Inquisition preferred ambiguity, both to protect its image and to avoid martyr narratives. But certain patterns are undeniable. Bruno was repeatedly threatened with torture. The instruments were described to him, the consequences explained in detail. In some accounts, he was brought to the chamber and shown what awaited him if he persisted. Whether he was physically tortured or not, the psychological violence was relentless. He was told his books were burned. He was told his ideas were forgotten. He was told no one remembered his name. They told him the universe he imagined did not exist. And soon, neither would he. Years passed. 7 years is a long time to sit with the knowledge that your death has already been decided, but the date withheld. Every interrogation carried the possibility that it would be the last. Every return to his cell could be preparation for execution. This uncertainty was not accidental. The Inquisition wanted him to crack, not from pain, but from anticipation. At several points, Bruno appeared to waver, not in belief, but in strategy. He attempted partial concessions, carefully worded statements that acknowledged error without surrendering core ideas. The Inquisitors seized upon these moments, pushing harder, drafting confessions for him to sign. One such document carefully avoided mentioning cosmology directly. It focused instead on obedience, on submission to church authority, on the renunciation of errors without specifying them. It was a trap. Bruno recognized it immediately. Signing would mean admitting that truth flowed from authority, not reason, that ideas were crimes, that obedience outweighed conscience. He refused again. By 1599, patience had evaporated. The case was escalated. Higher authorities were consulted. The Pope himself was informed. The verdict was never truly in doubt. But the church still wanted a victory greater than death. They wanted surrender. In early 1600, Bruno was presented with a final ultimatum. He was given 8 days. 8 days to reflect. 8 days to reconsider. 8 days to save his life. He was allowed limited access to clergy during this time, men trained not in philosophy but persuasion. They appealed to fear, to faith, to exhaustion. They told him he had suffered enough. They told him God would forgive him. They told him death by fire was unimaginably painful. They were right about that last part. Bruno asked questions. He debated quietly. He listened, and at the end of the 8 days, he returned his answer. No. On February 8, 1600, Giordano Bruno was formally declared an impenitent, obstinate heretic. The sentence was death by burning. When the verdict was read, witnesses recorded a moment of silence. Then Bruno spoke. "You pronounced this sentence against me with greater fear than I receive it." Those words sealed everything. From that moment on, he was no longer a prisoner awaiting judgment. He was a condemned man awaiting spectacle. In the days before his execution, the church took precautions. Bruno was not to be allowed to speak publicly. No last sermons. No declarations. No chance to inspire. They feared his voice even now. On the morning of February 17th, guards entered his cell. He was stripped naked, his hands bound, his tongue immobilized with an iron clamp. This was not mercy. It was control. He was placed on a cart and taken through Rome toward Campo de Fiori. The streets were narrow, the air cold. The crowd thickened as word spread. At the square, the stake stood ready. It was piled high. Pitch added. The executioner waited. Bruno was tied upright. The gag remained in place. And as the fire was lit, the church believed it had erased the problem. It was wrong. The fire was not lit in haste. That detail mattered too. Executions carried out by the Roman Inquisition were rituals, not reactions. Every movement was deliberate. Every delay calculated. The purpose was not simply to kill Giordano Bruno. It was to make his death instructive. Campo de Fiori was already crowded by the time the cart arrived. Market stalls had been cleared away, replaced by soldiers, clerics, and officials. The square that usually smelled of bread, herbs, and fresh produce now reeked of pitch and damp wood. The stake stood at the center, upright and immovable, a vertical promise of what Defiant earned. Bruno was lifted from the cart and positioned before it. His feet barely touched the ground as they bound him. Rope cut into skin already weakened by years of confinement. His body trembled, not from fear, but from cold and exhaustion. He had been denied proper food in the days leading up to the execution. Hunger made men pliable. The church hoped even now he might break. A final attempt was made. A priest approached him, holding a crucifix up to his face. The iron clamp still held Bruno's tongue, forcing his mouth partially open, preventing clear speech. The message was unmistakable. One nod, one gesture of submission, and this could still end differently. Bruno turned his head away. It was the last act of resistance he would be allowed. The executioner stepped forward. It was stacked tightly around Bruno's legs and waist, arranged to ensure the flames would rise slowly. Too fast, and death would come quickly. Too slow, and the spectacle would drag. The balance was intentional. When the torch touched the wood, smoke rose first, thick, black, choking. It curled upward, wrapping around Bruno's body before the flames followed. Fire does not leap instantly. It tests, it searches for weakness. As the heat intensified, Bruno's skin blistered. Muscles contracted involuntarily. Breathing became agony. The lungs filled with superheated air, searing from the inside. Consciousness fades, not immediately, but gradually, in waves of pain so overwhelming that the mind retreats to survive. The crowd watched. Some prayed aloud. Some turned away. Some stared without expression. Public executions had dulled sensitivity, but this one carried weight. Even those loyal to the church sensed that something more than punishment was happening here. This was eradication. Accounts differ on how long Bruno remained conscious. Some witnesses claimed he died quickly. Others described prolonged suffering. The truth is likely somewhere in between, and no less horrific for it. When it was over, there was no body to bury, no remains to mourn. Ashes were scattered to prevent relics from forming. Memory itself was to be denied a focal point. The church had learned that martyrs grow powerful when remembered. In the days following the execution, official statements were carefully crafted. Bruno was described as a stubborn heretic, executed only after years of patience and mercy. His ideas were labeled dangerous fantasies. His death framed as regrettable but necessary. Behind closed doors, the message was clearer. This is what happens when you refuse to submit. Orders were sent out to reaffirm censorship. Books were reviewed. Universities warned. Scholars reminded of their obligations. The index of forbidden books was updated. Bruno's works explicitly condemned. Owning them became a crime. Teaching them became a risk. Even mentioning his name could draw suspicion. And yet, fear has a strange side effect. It spreads attention. Across Europe, whispers circulated. Not loudly, not openly, but persistently. A philosopher burned alive for believing the universe was infinite. A man killed not for violence, but for thought. In academic circles, Bruno became a cautionary tale. Professors warned students quietly, do not follow this path. Do not ask these questions. Do not go this far. But some listened differently. Some wondered what ideas could frighten the church enough to require fire. The immediate impact of Bruno's execution was chilling. Intellectual inquiry slowed in some regions. Self-censorship became common. Writers softened language. Philosophers disguised arguments as metaphors. Scientists framed discoveries as hypothetical, careful never to challenge doctrine directly. This climate of fear was precisely what the Inquisition wanted. But history does not freeze so easily. Over time, the memory of Bruno refused to vanish. His books survived in private collections, hidden libraries, marginal notes. His ideas resurfaced in altered forms, stripped his name, but not his influence. Later thinkers would walk carefully around the territory he acclaimed boldly. Galileo Galilei, decades later, would face his own trial for supporting heliocentrism. Unlike Bruno, Galileo recanted. He lived, and in doing so, demonstrated the lesson the church hoped to teach: survival through submission. But even Galileo's caution could not stop the momentum. The universe continued to expand, not physically, but conceptually. Telescopes improved. Observations multiplied. Old models strained under new evidence. The idea of an infinite cosmos no longer seemed absurd. It seemed inevitable. Centuries passed. The church never officially rehabilitated Bruno. His condemnation remained. His execution justified. But outside ecclesiastical authority, perceptions shifted. By the 19th century, Bruno was no longer viewed solely as a heretic. He was reimagined as a martyr for free thought, a symbol of resistance against intellectual tyranny. In 1889, nearly 300 years after his death, a statue was erected at Campo de' Fiori. It depicts Bruno cloaked, hooded, staring directly toward the Vatican. Not in anger, not in triumph, in judgment. The church protested the monument fiercely. It recognized the danger of symbols. But it was too late. Bruno's execution had failed in its ultimate goal. It did not erase him. It preserved him. And perhaps the most disturbing part of the story is not that Giordano Bruno was burned alive. It is that his death was entirely legal. Every step followed procedure. Every interrogation documented. Every delay justified. The system that killed him believed itself righteous. which raises an uncomfortable truth. Bruno was not destroyed by chaos or cruelty alone, but by order, by structure, by institutions convinced they were defending truth. That is what made his 7-year torture so effective. Not because it was brutal, but because it was methodical. He was given time to reconsider, time to reflect, time to break himself. He chose not to, and in that refusal, Giordano Bruno forced history to confront a question it still struggles to answer. How much control should any authority have over thought itself? Long after the smoke from Campo de' Fiori dissolved into the Roman sky, the church believed the problem of Giordano Bruno had been solved. There was no body to mourn, no grave to visit, no relics to venerate. His books were banned. His name was poison. His ideas officially condemned as madness. The machinery of authority had done what it always did best: cleaned the record, sealed the files, and moved on. But history does not obey verdicts. It listens instead to echoes. In the decades following Bruno's execution, Europe entered a strange silence. Not an absence of thought, but a careful muting of it. Scholars still questioned, still observed, still theorized, but quietly, cautiously, always aware where the invisible lines were drawn. The lesson of Bruno had been learned. Do not say everything you think. Do not publish everything you know. Do not confuse curiosity with courage. Fear had done its work. Universities adjusted their language. Natural philosophers wrapped discoveries in layers of theological obedience. Arguments were framed as hypotheticals, not beliefs. New ideas were introduced slowly, carefully, like contraband passed hand to hand. This was not progress halted. It was progress wounded. And yet, despite every attempt to contain it, the universe Giordano Bruno imagined continued to press inward on human understanding. Telescopes improved. Observations contradicted scripture-based cosmology. The heavens no longer behaved as Aristotle promised they would. Stars shifted. Planets wandered. Certainty cracked. Men like Galileo would later step into this widening fracture between authority and evidence. But Galileo had Bruno's shadow to guide him. He knew how far defiance could go. When faced with the same machine, he bent. Bruno had not, and that difference mattered. For centuries, Bruno remained an uncomfortable figure. Too radical for the church, too mystical for strict scientists, too philosophical for simple martyrdom. He did not fit neatly into any box. That made him easy to ignore. But the ideas he died for did not disappear. They simply changed hands. The infinite universe, once heresy, became hypothesis, then theory, then assumption. Today, children learn casually that the stars are suns, that galaxies stretch beyond counting, that the cosmos has no known center. What once required fire to suppress now barely raises an eyebrow. And that transformation carries a cost we rarely acknowledge, because progress did not arrive peacefully. It arrived dragged through prison cells, sealed interrogation rooms, censored manuscripts, and burning stakes. Giordano Bruno was not executed because he proved the universe was infinite. He was executed because he refused to accept that truth required permission. That distinction is everything. The church of his time claimed authority not only over souls, but over reality itself. To challenge its cosmology was to challenge its legitimacy. If Earth was not the center of creation, perhaps Rome was not either. Bruno understood this intuitively. That was why he frightened them. He did not merely propose new ideas. He dismantled a foundation that allowed authority to define truth. And once that foundation cracks, control follows. This is why his 7-year imprisonment mattered more than the fire. The burning was an ending. The imprisonment was the message. 7 years to reconsider. 7 years to doubt himself. 7 years to surrender quietly. The Inquisition did not want a corpse. It wanted obedience. And Bruno's greatest crime was not heresy. It was refusal. He refused to lie for comfort. He refused to recant for survival. He refused to pretend certainty where none existed. In doing so, he exposed a core fear of every authoritarian system. That truth cannot be forced. Centuries later, when a statue of Bruno was erected at Campo de' Fiori, the church protested fiercely. Officials claimed it glorified heresy, that it insulted faith, that it reopened old wounds. But the protest revealed something deeper. They were still afraid of him. Not of the man, long dead, long turned to ash, but of what he represented. A reminder that no institution, no matter how powerful, can permanently silence ideas whose time has come. Bruno stands in that square today, hooded, head bowed slightly forward, facing the Vatican, not in triumph, not in defiance, in witness. He does not accuse. He remembers. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of his legacy. Giordano Bruno did not claim certainty. He did not pretend to possess ultimate truth. He argued instead for infinite possibility, for a universe too vast to be confined by doctrine, too complex to be owned, in a world desperate for certainty. That was unforgivable. Even now, his story forces an uncomfortable question. How many ideas have been lost not because they were wrong, but because they were dangerous to power? How many minds have been broken quietly, without statues, without names, without remembrance? Bruno survived history because his death was public, but countless others vanished in silence. And that is the true horror. The fire at Campo de' Fiori was visible. The smoke rose high. The crowd gathered. But the real destruction happened underground, in cells without windows, in years that left no marks except endurance. That machinery still exists in different forms. Wherever authority decides what may be questioned, wherever belief is enforced rather than earned, wherever obedience is valued above truth. Giordano Bruno's execution belongs to the past, but its logic does not. And that is why his story endures. Because it is not really about cosmology. It is not really about heresy. It is about control. And about what happens when one human being refuses to surrender the sovereignty of his own mind. As the flames consumed him, Bruno did not know if history would remember him kindly, or at all. He did not know statues would be built. He did not know his ideas would one day be taught freely. He only knew one thing, that living a lie was worse than dying for truth. And that choice, made alone, gag-bound, surrounded by fire, echoes far beyond Rome. It echoes every time a question is silenced, every time curiosity is punished, every time fear is used to define reality. Giordano Bruno burned so that others might think without permission. The universe he imagined did not end with him. It only began to be seen. If stories like this matter, if the hidden horrors of history deserve light, subscribe and stay with us, because the past is not done with us yet.